85,536,291 times 259,341,089 equals what? 721,850,153 times 108 million equals what? 3,073,084 times 5,567,955 equals what? 89,502,480 times 10 million equals what? 709,003 times 66,675 equals what? 720,588 times 20,010 equals what? 48,377,871 times 78,344,099 equals what? 405,200,000 times 314,357,645 equals what? 2,130,008 times 141,204,851 equals what? 94,924,874 times 30,070,000 equals what? 8,000 times 905,590,300 equals what? 3,500,000 times 821,000 equals what? 700,000,009 times 61,074,397 equals what? 88,570,646 times 100,030,507 equals what? 10,280,012 times 4 equals what? 278,810 times 335,758 equals what? 29,856,396 times 4,567,889 equals what? 532,542,410 times 4 million equals what? 88 times 40,000 equals what? 560,670 times 900 million equals what? 540,803,000 times 41,004,000 equals what? 55,933,174 times 10,000 equals what? 96,530 times 80,000 equals what? 801,362,193 times 313,480,016 equals what? 980 times 775,817,154 equals what? 4,978 times 489,182,931 equals what? 271,509,245 times 345,003,148 equals what? 95,490,742 times 1,452,401 equals what? 335,927,428 times 14,153,064 equals what? 648,093,400 times 960,070 equals what? 9 times 329,806 equals what? 77,482,520 times 95,384,113 equals what? 732,653,368 times 240,237,542 equals what? 905,077,451 times 9,943,033 equals what? 413,216,506 times 220,493,258 equals what? 792,558 times 908,462,253 equals what? 47,640,147 times 300 million equals what? 497,621,234 times 5,985 equals what? 515,219,007 times 20,442,924 equals what? 327,213 times 2,008 equals what? 451,170,154 times 439,216,045 equals what? 5,882 times 849 equals what? 32,747 times 18 million equals what? 994,542,366 times 79,222,120 equals what? 71,093,003 times 300 million equals what? 219,010,100 times 728,386,527 equals what? 2,826,192 times 996,479,912 equals what? 1 times 5,000 equals what? 46,469,228 times 70,350 equals what? 618,938,738 times 72,156,325 equals what? 571,126,768 times 400,400,908 equals what? 8,365,564 times 2,607,047 equals what? 873,500 times 972,674,633 equals what? 490,000 times 862,402,958 equals what? 80,043,159 times 687,193,556 equals what? 862,495 times 768 equals what? 78 times 172,878,382 equals what? 175,332 times 106,600,058 equals what? 684,315,505 times 10,030,820 equals what? 19,472 times 265,770,005 equals what? 177,512,889 times 575,871,517 equals what? 400,655,000 times 660,408,201 equals what? 100,137,083 times 80,079,000 equals what? 189,192,775 times 605,104,030 equals what? 58,825,722 times 700,051,060 equals what? 846,834,758 times 21,743,455 equals what? 4,551,268 times 851,251,611 equals what? 798,462,366 times 564,222,432 equals what? 216,123,527 times 25,810,500 equals what? 915,067,309 times 610,610,432 equals what? 80,046 times 700,000 equals what? 643,023,619 times 70 million equals what? 75,338,561 times 87,196 equals what? 90,050,038 times 232,870,994 equals what? 180,452,016 times 30,500,328 equals what? 40,360,195 times 455,575,401 equals what? 2,795,848 times 70,278,183 equals what? 346,900,004 times 887,376 equals what? 3,852,013 times 9,187 equals what? 213,575,606 times 910,092,600 equals what? 603,056,319 times 812,622,162 equals what? 35,030 times 4,904,000 equals what? 594,737,549 times 56,073,422 equals what? 730,287,006 times 4,728,375 equals what? 414,544,277 times 101,890,085 equals what? 358,476 times 921,868,842 equals what? 355,678,522 times 56,112,238 equals what? 525,393,247 times 79,386,084 equals what? 598,586,901 times 405,230,701 equals what? 717,504,090 times 650,403 equals what? 141,409,190 times 5,349,559 equals what? 60,380,400 times 47,163,590 equals what? 9,218,621 times 608,696 equals what? 499,188,666 times 111,682,324 equals what? 100,060,056 times 370,020,006 equals what? 13,067 times 70,949,830 equals what? 702,985 times 169,543 equals what? 763,427,797 times 401,779,118 equals what? 76,500,600 times 840,700,796 equals what? 87,046,104 times 553,842 equals what? 500,040,000 times 849,357,102 equals what? 899,309,070 times 34,922,915 equals what? 55,803,152 times 406,190,952 equals what? 133,338,847 times 804,000 equals what? 978,762,255 times 628,977,070 equals what? 562,651,085 times 635,082,280 equals what? 4,240 times 7,000,004 equals what? 547,848,299 times 235,335,633 equals what? 814,024,188 times 3,000 equals what? 7612 times 596,946,524 equals what? 854,161,733 times 70,810,001 equals what? 60,000 times 40,060 equals what? 50,800,040 times 702,007 equals what? 72,632,270 times 234,925,518 equals what? 9,000,000 times 46,645,898 equals what? 239,901,864 times 254,068,052 equals what? 125,006,411 times 590,791,992 equals what? 147,001 times 16 equals what? 100,600,091 times 925,812,508 equals what? 30,000 times 35 equals what? 90,580 times 204 equals what? 988,260 times 43,900 equals what? 738,983,271 times 591,043,691 equals what? 626,470,472 times 240,040,090 equals what? 205,001,431 times 104,800 equals what? 672,173,132 times 80,009,100 equals what? 49 times 165,943 equals what? 800 million times 56,214,161 equals what? 118,917 times 9,585,870 equals what? 117,987,831 times 563,022,770 equals what? 18,203,044 times 3,700,605 equals what? 267,914,821 times 14,906,472 equals what? 345,700 times 384,741 equals what? 540,000 times 100 million equals what? 500,600,000 times 400 million equals what? 780,070,218 times 724,514,641 equals what? 2,790,465 times 348,377,400 equals what? 49,903,516 times 9,467,981 equals what? 30,035 times 500,040 equals what? 800,805 times 300,400 equals what? 765,090,500 times 26,034,184 equals what? 605,473,060 times 9,570 equals what? 5,802 times 78 equals what? 421,067,058 times 639 equals what? 800 million times 12,672,426 equals what? 99,778,260 times 5,256,607 equals what? 2,060,002 times 93,397,140 equals what? 820,091,000 times 90,030,001 equals what? 504,100,090 times 685,027,699 equals what? 943,779,235 times 251,885,192 equals what? 5,020 times 87,234,317 equals what? 54,100 times 572,246,532 equals what? 52,006,706 times 104,401 equals what? 982,439,479 times 500 million equals what? 700,040,750 times 878,554,680 equals what? 500 million times 265,000 equals what? 9,372,645 times 53,521,210 equals what? 971,500,109 times 219,711,029 equals what? 328,885,291 times 933,493,731 equals what? 80,080,008 times 800,750,001 equals what? 8,096 times 689 equals what? 88,972,323 times 16,527,227 equals what? 900,000 times 8 million equals what? 1 times 417,936,496 equals what? 534,511,477 times 527,805,503 equals what? 838,821,206 times 49,246,945 equals what? 297,688 times 197,759,552 equals what? 683,937,676 times 144,325,272 equals what? 85,322,078 times 60,901 equals what? 448,689,297 times 188,170,838 equals what? 203,116,070 times 760,524,494 equals what? 38,779,741 times 78,046,000 equals what? 400 million times 41,390,905 equals what? 3,010 times 7,249 equals what? 75,521,332 times 395,487 equals what? 663,184,982 times 230,900,001 equals what? 118,054,360 times 6,725 equals what? 245,303,278 times 562,991,649 equals what? 5 million times 4 million equals what? 177,187,638 times 4,100,007 equals what? 20,075,669 times 586,719,185 equals what? 100,005,600 times 852,669,150 equals what? 972,579,418 times 65,854,600 equals what? 38,624,955 times 29,685,712 equals what? 700,008,000 times 400 million equals what? 703,074,312 times 25,503,206 equals what? 230,010,002 times 50,400,003 equals what? 60 times 895,071,038 equals what? 200,300 times 225,599 equals what? 5,003 times 790,060 equals what? 97,080,000 times 400,000 equals what? 9,124,519 times 619,146,237 equals what? 55,230,842 times 516,744,680 equals what? 55,084,600 times 3,895 equals what? 1,936,641 times 58,067,215 equals what? 232,717 times 836,782,991 equals what? 500,524,008 times 881,453,851 equals what? 409,938,355 times 402,931,401 equals what? 189,736,104 times 6,047 equals what? 3,713 times 3 equals what? 530 times 7,993 equals what? 242,608 times 20,802,572 equals what? 94,673,472 times 319,196,192 equals what? 724,886,940 times 62,337,998 equals what? 2,000,000 times 593,010,337 equals what? 6,608,000 times 8,217,575 equals what? 100,470,030 times 858,603,699 equals what? 325,080,722 times 108,600,002 equals what? 7,754 times 833 equals what? 844,530,395 times 38,176,476 equals what? 768,152,499 times 642,828,037 equals what? 240,900,200 times 62,050,320 equals what? 8,132,036 times 9,380,996 equals what? 981,122,528 times 56,381,184 equals what? 618,709 times 461,020,682 equals what? 34,308 times 101,000 equals what? 913,944 times 49,088,762 equals what? 913,477 times 329,941,586 equals what? 903,140,045 times 388,004,592 equals what? 935,025,757 times 43,121 equals what? 87,565,271 times 69,662,052 equals what? 166,688,721 times 500,105 equals what? 841,220,300 times 517,121,729 equals what? 38,967,603 times 975,384,757 equals what? 80 million times 700 million equals what? 390,581,272 times 934,339,897 equals what? 982,274,176 times 497,667,626 equals what? 52,435,086 times 11,042,728 equals what? 5,445,873 times 4,010,209 equals what? 5 times 60,004,000 equals what? 490,870 times 580,012,912 equals what? 174,150 times 2 equals what? 200,600 times 90,500,020 equals what? 22,720,586 times 400,000 equals what? 1,418,772 times 137,680,189 equals what? 767,859,291 times 213,257,494 equals what? 24,944,008 times 3,904,688 equals what? 9,497,204 times 699,426,378 equals what? 29,685,752 times 60,079,301 equals what? 717,269,610 times 481,068,596 equals what? 91,549,013 times 867,912,238 equals what? 80,605,475 times 288,325,079 equals what? 789,280 times 37,590,255 equals what? 241 times 3,689 equals what? 60,754 times 70,000 equals what? 11,964,917 times 845,979,234 equals what? 488,577,267 times 88,628,437 equals what? 43,426,037 times 200 million equals what? 60,907,526 times 808,936 equals what? 13,336,233 times 26,998,460 equals what? 700,203,030 times 68,042,960 equals what? 690,635 times 547,208,494 equals what? 974,467 times 990,100 equals what? 270 million times 12,471 equals what? 408,708 times 76,573,935 equals what? 70,937 times 100,070 equals what? 70,001,000 times 7 equals what? 7,396,988 times 63,694,925 equals what? 200,800,000 times 30,510,270 equals what? 96,020 times 60,005,002 equals what? 20,652,300 times 902,444,744 equals what? 7,159 times 5 equals what? 852,440,697 times 102,515 equals what? 768,084,775 times 961,725,459 equals what? 699,652,495 times 744,200,899 equals what? 818,009,173 times 7,778,432 equals what? 256,052,431 times 2,945,791 equals what? 805,170,000 times 900,008,070 equals what? 643,524,345 times 4,013,000 equals what? 1,087,301 times 723,002 equals what? 13,726,287 times 190,843,908 equals what? 38,211,180 times 946,880,150 equals what? 218,564,968 times 690,135,948 equals what? 500 million times 100,100,200 equals what? 897,383,982 times 567,259,623 equals what? 228,101,864 times 1,050 equals what? 24,192,546 times 61,558,837 equals what? 840,317,622 times 414,465,357 equals what? 79,025,534 times 57,239,292 equals what? 500,214,681 times 93,722,914 equals what? 10 times 41,822 equals what? 48,046 times 400,200,040 equals what? 3,287,040 times 300,230,303 equals what? 440,942,726 times 302,759,302 equals what? 13,708 times 53,363,523 equals what? 5,931,851 times 99,793,617 equals what? 864,178,323 times 758,832,803 equals what? 707,222 times 467,796 equals what? 400,500,085 times 130,653,226 equals what? 17,475,334 times 679,868,546 equals what? 40 million times 554,040,010 equals what? 78,227,172 times 807,453,490 equals what? 597,489 times 501,184 equals what? 431,552,379 times 7,543,092 equals what? 276,159 times 75,546 equals what? 971,308,149 times 387,243,910 equals what? 146,786,929 times 300,002,502 equals what? 765,264,474 times 247,202,635 equals what? 41,047,360 times 694,091,072 equals what? 530,200,000 times 577,590,426 equals what? 30,115,544 times 7,315,246 equals what? 39,693,331 times 495,404,737 equals what? 580,267 times 24,385 equals what? 436,646,633 times 307,065,077 equals what? 675,176 times 357,925,295 equals what? 404,360,000 times 403,534,971 equals what? 3,642,975 times 8,588 equals what? 90,001,110 times 83,601,988 equals what? 308,303,850 times 529,009,329 equals what? 481,006 times 5,900 equals what? 56,563,943 times 830,390,932 equals what? 325,382,488 times 638,155,830 equals what? 896,832,564 times 510,078,465 equals what? 571,257,730 times 57,309,030 equals what? 100,900,080 times 100,090,410 equals what? 638,042,952 times 76,311,791 equals what? 99,343 times 530,435,373 equals what? 911,183,126 times 97,607 equals what? 175,160,943 times 695,668,633 equals what? 215,193,432 times 530,741 equals what? 80 million times 426,902,420 equals what? 80,090 times 241,910 equals what? 408,383,244 times 184,096,084 equals what? 6,382 times 600,087,057 equals what? 508,001,352 times 420,768,845 equals what? 366,526,730 times 21,127,715 equals what? 88,493,940 times 69,157 equals what? 51,829,426 times 2,600,008 equals what? 80,980,026 times 1,000,007 equals what? 800,000,003 times 500,000,000 equals what? 61,067 times 4,135 equals what? 547,060,512 times 83,622,560 equals what? 561,315 times 794,900 equals what? 80,040,000 times 550,000,007 equals what? 400,000,005 times 8,000 equals what? 404,418,734 times 80,030,070 equals what? 507,363 times 3,002,751 equals what? 686,967 times 7,409,821 equals what? 980,042,440 times 800,910 equals what? 889,295,711 times 16,093,080 equals what? 3,852 times 714,654,232 equals what? 783,069,735 times 57 equals what? 41,403,271 times 1,559,763 equals what? 600,001,150 times 352,040,375 equals what? 97,901 times 8,430,003 equals what? 200 times 293,970 equals what? 24 times 6,070,030 equals what? 800,006,000 times 17,910,200 equals what? 6,691,624 times 171,287,179 equals what? 9,046 times 22,134 equals what? 900,080,000 times 700,000,000 equals what? 40,000,000 times 106,005,009 equals what? 743,036 times 50 equals what? 500,070,850 times 2,362,213 equals what? 769,134,948 times 701,900,015 equals what? 90,000 times 38,019,700 equals what? 942,829,125 times 96,500,250 equals what? 253,103,687 times 257,570,542 equals what? 752,916,272 times 9,200,302 equals what? 90 times 996,020,000 equals what? 161,823,315 times 70,860,616 equals what? 574,237,027 times 24,370 equals what? 572,828 times 28,833,952 equals what? 393,306,076 times 749,691,955 equals what? 964,805,010 times 49,340 equals what? 4,472,484 times 302,801,922 equals what? 970,641 times 92,464 equals what? 804,681,708 times 900 million equals what? 60 million times 60,500,050 equals what? 462,050,557 times 27,469,414 equals what? 334,300,200 times 49,099,033 equals what? 40,358 times 64,940,000 equals what? 9,700,000 times 9 equals what? 394,376,902 times 64,550,007 equals what? 91,780,748 times 60,101,000 equals what? 6,796,072 times 435,743,118 equals what? 701,750,898 times 111 equals what? 58,288,935 times 1,964,798 equals what? 346,601 times 800,005,874 equals what? 32,284,939 times 399,988,137 equals what? 578,179,682 times 8,520,104 equals what? 860,081 times 76,675,233 equals what? 178,932,344 times 493,946,282 equals what? 9,003,000 times 3,008 equals what? 4,010,000 times 462,994,252 equals what? 700 times 28 million equals what? 971,994,551 times 12,607,212 equals what? 900 million 9 times 394,788,923 equals what? 15,705,190 times 99,996,746 equals what? 900 million times 173,767 equals what? 272,850,607 times 776,005,987 equals what? 8,006 times 90,600 equals what? 918,790,662 times 605,004,479 equals what? 44,156,644 times 6,517,009 equals what? 280,030,600 times 596,186,471 equals what? 586,525,792 times 294,070,037 equals what? 610,030,000 times 840,796,715 equals what? 59,075 times 400,000 equals what? 46,330,937 times 80 million equals what? 69,207,452 times 1,304,313 equals what? 453,435,020 times 1,500,400 equals what? 399,852 times 360,774,233 equals what? 2,868,825 times 200,742 equals what? 11,545 times 4,377,601 equals what? 405,054,209 times 601,095,781 equals what? 947,541,853 times 79,158,595 equals what? 600,490,044 times 81,805,074 equals what? 6,896 times 5,417 equals what? 987,177 times 83,624,424 equals what? 779,863,986 times 2,520,224 equals what? 8 million times 48,831,281 equals what? 32,291,070 times 7,910,452 equals what? 8,836,983 times 244,294 equals what? 650,810,209 times 59 million equals what? 11,148,961 times 300,009,000 equals what? 560,111,650 times 17,007,000 equals what? 397,292,202 times 17,673,348 equals what? 7,006 times 920,055,886 equals what? 300,659 times 35,031 equals what? 58 times 842,105 equals what? 4,300 times 700,701,509 equals what? 1,007,000 times 560,350 equals what? 20 times 5,406,044 equals what? 617,392,218 times 45,600,390 equals what? 90,614,237 times 8,622 equals what? 880,992,689 times 56,606,610 equals what? 7 times 292,977 equals what? 487,530,168 times 100,000 equals what? 20,740,845 times 723,169,050 equals what? 549,770,735 times 240,773 equals what? 32,164 times 40,070 equals what? 171,511,976 times 927,033,854 equals what? 1,777,929 times 101,095,080 equals what? 14,852,364 times 257,178,437 equals what? 79,911,011 times 698,281,870 equals what? 254,675,933 times 28,008 equals what? 247,921,338 times 200,021,406 equals what? 444,821,874 times 432,009,000 equals what? 29,330,000 times 936,507,008 equals what? 294,004,502 times 35,987,534 equals what? 5,034,932 times 201,004,411 equals what? 7,069,009 times 100 equals what? 801,500,638 times 613,163,552 equals what? 891,414,256 times 720,903,903 equals what? 710,105,000 times 200,090,050 equals what? 39,128 times 301,090,032 equals what? 513,468 times 721,200,406 equals what? 50,040 times 2,080,905 equals what? 356,636,126 times 817,934,694 equals what? 698,750,512 times 400,090 equals what? 600,466,173 times 1,408,192 equals what? 300 million times 147,400,000 equals what? 628,424,604 times 888,135,692 equals what? 582,770,600 times 845,137,163 equals what? 380,352,480 times 157,823,879 equals what? 292,855,908 times 863,575,995 equals what? 33 million times 590,007,053 equals what? 90,037,000 times 806,400,098 equals what? 811,945,617 times 497,852,621 equals what? 610,800 times 4,559,015 equals what? 830,680,307 times 9,004,079 equals what? 226,830,577 times 60,070,000 equals what? 306,001 times 595,245,322 equals what? 784,855,829 times 24,815,325 equals what? 35,426,643 times 560 million equals what? 16,520 times 60,582,981 equals what? 9,869,440 times 342,258,249 equals what?
928,163,845 times 81,867,612 equals what? 586,001,268 times 1,848,323 equals what? 45,704,406 times 690,086,086 equals what? 95,391,611 times 528,492,493 equals what? 600,900,005 times 804,297,839 equals what? 500,275,265 times 321,734,665 equals what? 658,356,202 times 9,003,000 equals what? 300,030,503 times 102,801,343 equals what? 762,580,412 times 2,595,914 equals what? 48,325 times 39 equals what? 700 times 40,437,040 equals what? 613,130,195 times 9,380,900 equals what? 30,002 times 582 equals what? 4,804 times 5,810,084 equals what? 10,003 times 123,808,496 equals what? 804,897,308 times 21,426,675 equals what? 7,962 times 46,288 equals what? 61,006,820 times 1,010,062 equals what? 100,000 times 859,243,725 equals what? 100 times 802,020 equals what? 95,503 times 559,924 equals what? 332,335 times 8,357 equals what? 6,795,773 times 56,215,473 equals what? 311,503,593 times 900 million equals what? 198,006,733 times 62,612,046 equals what? 340,000 times 6,375,217 equals what? 99,477,511 times 2,000 equals what? 779,267,298 times 467,270,936 equals what? 702,592,001 times 609,220,078 equals what? 40,608,551 times 9,143,935 equals what? 9,009,188 times 740,542,672 equals what? 972,591,223 times 96,918 equals what? 855,854 times 254,118 equals what? 696,700,071 times 118,007,300 equals what? 15,643,122 times 972,133,900 equals what? 681,752,652 times 4,264,505 equals what? 80,700 times 900 million equals what? 5,800,565 times 294,047 equals what? 13,538,629 times 6,812,119 equals what? 402 million times 3,701 equals what? 639,043,954 times 497,879,169 equals what? 12,490,369 times 157,826,924 equals what? 364,439,979 times 353,137,009 equals what? 90,009,000 times 340,198,868 equals what? 703,000 times 80,012 equals what? 799,271,065 times 15,600,990 equals what? 516,388,239 times 19,736,503 equals what? 728,758 times 517,883,749 equals what? 2 times 760,000 equals what? 10,128 times 68,831,230 equals what? 3,336,680 times 507 equals what? 500,030 times 7,380,510 equals what? 696,225,857 times 758,779,791 equals what? 29,891,649 times 692,683,706 equals what? 300,102,302 times 4,130,539 equals what? 76 times 70,932 equals what? 708,645,168 times 280,520,002 equals what? 500,140 times 897,674,170 equals what? 8,430,090 times 3 million equals what? 38,700,147 times 84,021 equals what? 1,057,883 times 64,790,125 equals what? 3,900 times 6 million equals what? 2,847,719 times 9,321 equals what? 69,009 times 640 equals what? 8,409,279 times 30,327,215 equals what? 741,285,876 times 6,760 equals what? 500,019,090 times 194,008,148 equals what? 286,043,041 times 538,999,679 equals what? 70,050 times 6,236,713 equals what? 714,142,236 times 338,811,987 equals what? 678 times 520,655 equals what? 16,944,278 times 100,090,630 equals what? 26,820,310 times 486,380,364 equals what? 173,841,314 times 791,534 equals what? 49,334,716 times 468,912,426 equals what? 50,003,020 times 901,638,005 equals what? 4,208,950 times 18,032 equals what? 200 times 200 million equals what? 584 times 8,000 equals what? 890,433,382 times 390,309,008 equals what? 1,461,141 times 3,575,439 equals what? 468,351,365 times 737,099,000 equals what? 1,987,393 times 5,701,720 equals what? 872,935,303 times 868,539,694 equals what? 953,014 times 742,334 equals what? 6,493 times 342,519,979 equals what? 50,003,000 times 189 equals what? 88,647,978 times 454,913,944 equals what? 20 million times 700,407 equals what? 3,705,106 times 90,040 equals what? 650,033,538 times 696,893,783 equals what? 37,719,631 times 103,050,000 equals what? 118,366,403 times 7,399 equals what? 797,458 times 410,079 equals what? 466,996 times 4,021,972 equals what? 639,682,078 times 346,040,006 equals what? 800,228,007 times 460,100,429 equals what? 3 times 26,957 equals what? 10,092 times 50,009,000 equals what? 230,902,992 times 20 equals what? 359 times 4,645 equals what? 374,408,644 times 7,841,318 equals what? 800,029,990 times 2,060,405 equals what? 345,465,684 times 139,040,343 equals what? 995,172,052 times 507,056,168 equals what? 899,991,799 times 1,364,003 equals what? 409,103,703 times 781,435,391 equals what? 520,719,176 times 42,461,909 equals what? 66,464,114 times 38,619,378 equals what? 8,135,882 times 252,924,997 equals what? 3,070,000 times 300,027 equals what? 351,770,739 times 5,234,730 equals what? 5,400,908 times 2,678,676 equals what? 430,400,069 times 700,004 equals what? 764,459,235 times 667,944,529 equals what? 3,200,000 times 900,000,000 equals what? 81 times 6,673,719 equals what? 72,410,504 times 208,870,198 equals what? 800,310,300 times 10 equals what? 50,797 times 43,005,002 equals what? 80 million times 900 million equals what? 73,141,639 times 433,675,876 equals what? 720,010 times 90,010,907 equals what? 85,526,648 times 3,150 equals what? 2,060 times 10,600 equals what? 849,102,600 times 90,952,880 equals what? 5,420 times 300,770 equals what? 68,771,628 times 946,801,120 equals what? 404,920 times 550,600,003 equals what? 614,543,157 times 794,436,657 equals what? 34,702,447 times 44,842,576 equals what? 500,797,200 times 19,039,733 equals what? 44,066,888 times 330,003 equals what? 555,338,314 times 775,613,434 equals what? 957,172,661 times 200,570,007 equals what? 16,413,911 times 428,508,050 equals what? 906,700,325 times 72 million equals what? 483,889,881 times 900,504,463 equals what? 646,116,160 times 4,676,895 equals what? 3,938,848 times 4,903,209 equals what? 40,974,960 times 64,416,716 equals what? 600 million times 700,000 equals what? 50,418 times 21,237,438 equals what? 5,905,302 times 420,363 equals what? 699,322 times 2,656,875 equals what? 255,181 times 602,004,438 equals what? 605,870,752 times 323,658,453 equals what? 110,076,040 times 834 equals what? 4,362 times 300,600,000 equals what? 26,678,726 times 88,723,367 equals what? 26,267,756 times 14,417,981 equals what? 310,075,107 times 779,127,229 equals what? 463,326 times 286,617,833 equals what? 5,800,102 times 977,176 equals what? 627,383 times 442 equals what? 52,294,903 times 6,580,695 equals what? 4 million times 500,200,000 equals what? 800 million times 10 million equals what? 56 times 33,001 equals what? 95,232,722 times 5,426,134 equals what? 5,765,006 times 862,841,322 equals what? 3,009,527 times 8,048,960 equals what? 755,886,916 times 57,619,591 equals what? 3,941,296 times 497,929,140 equals what? 138,360,402 times 220,523,826 equals what? 19,815,785 times 849,454 equals what? 80,600,000 times 214,040,052 equals what? 609,633,271 times 542,073,990 equals what? 382,837,804 times 175,772 equals what? 4 million times 700 million equals what? 47 times 606,414,000 equals what? 100,309,307 times 701,009,000 equals what? 780,551 times 768,775 equals what? 483,030,857 times 5,345,049 equals what? 968,177,464 times 2,581,213 equals what? 7,764,400 times 9,850,464 equals what? 217 times 927,175 equals what? 802,540,500 times 349,247,883 equals what? 14,466,775 times 30,773,660 equals what? 38,710,675 times 432,020 equals what? 212,126,013 times 934,381,887 equals what? 236,368,192 times 873,327 equals what? 530 million times 3,041 equals what? 200,010,020 times 14,003,460 equals what? 64,591,564 times 7 equals what? 64,159 times 763,278,362 equals what? 90,495,874 times 64,383,586 equals what? 140,581,373 times 42,845 equals what? 500,233,150 times 950,200 equals what? 557,189,825 times 834,751,344 equals what? 840,953,676 times 53,273,919 equals what? 395,274,281 times 50,805 equals what? 80,537,075 times 44,648,863 equals what? 711,253,399 times 266,317,250 equals what? 766,844,001 times 796,980,155 equals what? 68,046 times 10,700,265 equals what? 9,892 times 206,290 equals what? 41,941 times 11,444,941 equals what? 57,508,309 times 66,457,636 equals what? 8 million times 44,033 equals what? 781,170,041 times 30,404 equals what? 10,000 times 533,193,532 equals what? 205,338,902 times 978,115,682 equals what? 267,099,013 times 16,073,076 equals what? 6,003,502 times 5,000 equals what? 2,834,429 times 459,063 equals what? 83,209,916 times 594,424,670 equals what? 94,715,264 times 400 million equals what? 10,600,059 times 9 equals what? 737,758,814 times 95,727,746 equals what? 720,286,521 times 54,036,208 equals what? 91,172 times 300,374,000 equals what? 740,040,030 times 102,920 equals what? 42,007,116 times 914 equals what? 100,322,000 times 30,909 equals what? 30,067,400 times 930,789,972 equals what? 521,328,033 times 900,230 equals what? 2,471,931 times 367,869,253 equals what? 43,035,799 times 771,803,306 equals what? 833,060,367 times 80,699,718 equals what? 10,007,370 times 36,550,889 equals what? 434,744,265 times 3,050,000 equals what? 47,417,058 times 951,582,272 equals what? 179,431,094 times 800 million equals what? 456,021,301 times 9,596,523 equals what? 277,490,048 times 35,425,958 equals what? 41,943,235 times 355,314,562 equals what? 70,060,505 times 924,382 equals what? 87,850 times 915 equals what? 415,817 times 62,128 equals what? 39,506,899 times 170,009,000 equals what? 6,132 times 903,030,330 equals what? 265,968,527 times 800,307,700 equals what? 920,922,520 times 842,883,171 equals what? 181,267,737 times 681,900,746 equals what? 123,136,629 times 409,866,100 equals what? 570,538,000 times 15,012 equals what? 109,902,502 times 6,198,683 equals what? 483,457,576 times 8,275,935 equals what? 8,337,474 times 6,369,516 equals what? 42,479,785 times 2,654,776 equals what? 9 times 2,000 equals what? 600,213,956 times 4,737,428 equals what? 400,000 times 56,491,813 equals what? 306,740,573 times 3,914 equals what? 30,918 times 30,100 equals what? 46,804,634 times 7,000 equals what? 236,929,659 times 7,433,139 equals what? 880,303,000 times 20 million equals what? 56,592,676 times 70,040 equals what? 854,440,545 times 963,200 equals what? 260,009 times 200,000 equals what? 3,863 times 192,573,881 equals what? 388,794 times 56,086,526 equals what? 56,658,477 times 38,609 equals what? 541,919,857 times 794,061,159 equals what? 8 million times 827,183,600 equals what? 70,884,005 times 503,320,040 equals what? 647,532,345 times 379 equals what? 4,001,090 times 729,288,132 equals what? 5 million times 20 million 2 equals what? 760,010,000 times 53 equals what? 50 million times 20 million 75,100 equals what? 722,541,362 times 270,003,820 equals what? 50,222 times 720,008 equals what? 3,001 times 235,415,068 equals what? 4,008 times 570,030 equals what? 929,832,017 times 47,804,775 equals what? 249,139,941 times 93,720,980 equals what? 16,135,859 times 27,990,827 equals what? 422,302,593 times 516,805 equals what? 5,020,100 times 764,280 equals what? 646,803,674 times 226,669 equals what? 993,064,766 times 365,731,504 equals what? 680,099 times 5,000 equals what? 830,006,904 times 75,996,603 equals what? 290,879 times 697,968,251 equals what? 255,008 times 29 equals what? 219,914,685 times 78,773,236 equals what? 481,070,600 times 173,241,465 equals what? 404,553,098 times 59,004,454 equals what? 500 million times 90,500,000 equals what? 6,625,602 times 596,115,572 equals what? 119,436 times 273,273,241 equals what? 900 million times 3,050 equals what? 86,069 times 1,278,654 equals what? 2,502,704 times 900,000 equals what? 60 million times 680,040 equals what? 90,868,500 times 329,190,075 equals what? 45,254 times 620,349,336 equals what? 42,026 times 80,617 equals what? 770,508,687 times 426,100,101 equals what? 566,933,919 times 5,442,905 equals what? 3,795,433 times 202,053,499 equals what? 415,865,416 times 7,561,304 equals what? 82,044,920 times 120,201,490 equals what? 2,749,768 times 7,005,133 equals what? 604,208,997 times 37,279,416 equals what? 90,090,000 times 108,090 equals what? 481,997,023 times 8 million equals what? 20,070,001 times 526,302,755 equals what? 82,659,897 times 40,080,089 equals what? 1,926,341 times 723,142,755 equals what? 306 times 33,079,044 equals what? 673,447,366 times 426,925,013 equals what? 7 times 44,720,430 equals what? 55,757,238 times 600,407,009 equals what? 330,000 times 1,736,731 equals what? 810,659,453 times 840,300,000 equals what? 4 times 354,554,370 equals what? 305 times 50,308,010 equals what? 4,293,157 times 45,072,282 equals what? 733,048 times 38,222 equals what? 83,580,451 times 360,007,000 equals what? 32,630 times 700,050,900 equals what? 29,476,548 times 6,812,721 equals what? 13,774,889 times 300 equals what? 402,746,930 times 26 equals what? 756,522,415 times 143,797,070 equals what? 978,263,342 times 9,030 equals what? 381,157,278 times 500,606,032 equals what? 705,570,606 times 308,468,725 equals what? 765,878,226 times 57 equals what? 35,604,730 times 505,381,249 equals what? 850,300,079 times 618,654,450 equals what? 33,445,578 times 718,689,069 equals what? 3,792,791 times 176,954 equals what? 100,600,000 times 160,775,332 equals what? 355,066,706 times 350 million equals what? 28,498,180 times 7,943,984 equals what? 722,400,056 times 495,265,254 equals what? 65,361,997 times 8,427,774 equals what? 87,413 times 170,310,063 equals what? 7,308 times 423,023,150 equals what? 837,913,349 times 234,374,012 equals what? 2,416,165 times 119,647,124 equals what? 916,440 times 8,665,294 equals what? 147,274,898 times 80,400,033 equals what? 60,720,576 times 558,650,180 equals what? 7,614,159 times 670,000 equals what? 670,037 times 2 million equals what? 300 million times 902,240,000 equals what? 500,011 times 900 million 10,000 equals what? 100,800,650 times 88,025,851 equals what? 8,001,003 times 30 million equals what? 85,105,808 times 5,479,287 equals what? 300 times 20 million equals what? 83,997 times 4,190,004 equals what? 27,009,115 times 90,909,117 equals what? 955,393,361 times 1932 equals what? 1,280 times 20 equals what? 58 times 303,343 equals what? 935,426,360 times 564,483,588 equals what? 48,210,800 times 9,947,122 equals what? 92,090 times 30 million equals what? 800,400,000 times 900,007,108 equals what? 7,000 times 90,005,801 equals what? 777,126,686 times 448,838,992 equals what? 14,657,478 times 445,706,263 equals what? 78,503,977 times 50,520,027 equals what? 116,020,681 times 600,094 equals what? 5,533,875 times 3,454,538 equals what? 100,790 times 8,700 equals what? 3,004,699 times 600,043 equals what? 303,447,315 times 442,894,771 equals what? 1,659,437 times 431,911,746 equals what? 909,006,000 times 823,376,103 equals what? 300 times 2,718 equals what? 1,020 times 500,060 equals what? 600,091 times 733,720,336 equals what? 7,043,300 times 35,135 equals what? 628,013,270 times 600,004,274 equals what? 95,415,721 times 593,635 equals what? 86,702,876 times 7 million equals what? 664,852,020 times 291,296,559 equals what? 450,280,000 times 4,600,015 equals what? 885,226 times 70,006,015 equals what? 712,392,298 times 5,276,599 equals what? 510 times 60,007,000 equals what? 720,730,070 times 190,616,831 equals what? 965,415,699 times 777,503,620 equals what? 80 million times 3,093 equals what? 400 million times 884,015,844 equals what? 600,200,000 times 302,286 equals what? 550,969 times 770,382,697 equals what? 77,344,988 times 908,010,605 equals what? 85,595,820 times 322,935,606 equals what? 576,515,761 times 734,111,196 equals what? 519 times 4,288 equals what? 407,078,699 times 53,409 equals what? 300,000 times 19,321,454 equals what? 48,561 times 65 equals what? 36,506,190 times 135,966,453 equals what? 300 million times 131,885 equals what? 107,839,113 times 6,060,629 equals what? 63,033 times 1,700 equals what? 600,627,893 times 703,232,010 equals what? 288,239,021 times 40 equals what? 23,839 times 958,878 equals what? 217,123,298 times 601,600,200 equals what? 881,876,238 times 331,712,584 equals what? 144,344,918 times 89,503,082 equals what? 342,092,800 times 82,694,805 equals what? 7,653,385 times 320,253,664 equals what? 2,662,371 times 43,213 equals what? 629,343,482 times 297,865,603 equals what? 468,506,658 times 318,384 equals what? 37,099,060 times 7,074,168 equals what? 700,709 times 18,892,176 equals what? 120,039 times 191,185,971 equals what? 84,161,885 times 9,670,054 equals what? 70 million times 301 million equals what? 98,539,068 times 43,032 equals what? 2,000 times 76,067 equals what? 80,100 times 808,091,682 equals what? 56,505,709 times 201 equals what? 42,335 times 531,688,073 equals what? 351,140 times 700,000 equals what? 7,634,596 times 1,006 equals what? 20,508 times 900,000 equals what? 76,601,015 times 804 million equals what? 62,956,871 times 3,016,592 equals what? 33,114 times 20,020,030 equals what? 300,808,000 times 50 million equals what? 668,725 times 715,499,190 equals what? 70,150,000 times 195,042 equals what? 65,656,368 times 13,523,632 equals what? 90 times 351,506,202 equals what? 4,866,634 times 568,818,002 equals what? 200,103 times 592,961 equals what? 23,445,295 times 22,046,450 equals what? 26,181,781 times 960,220,123 equals what? 20 million times 520,421,579 equals what? 25,270,293 times 84,090,470 equals what? 300,057,013 times 538,305,166 equals what? 877,332,849 times 131,989,563 equals what? 900 million times 312,151,582 equals what? 807,310,440 times 2,670,086 equals what? 630,019,930 times 32,300,400 equals what? 67,492,509 times 5,470,603 equals what? 502,077,305 times 73,499,003 equals what? 686,511,840 times 51 equals what? 20 million times 277,708,080 equals what? 80,020,000 times 132,700,700 equals what? 28,079,406 times 14,609,800 equals what? 177,300 times 376,046,000 equals what? 4,502,084 times 756,258,411 equals what? 2,745,007 times 700,000 equals what? 70,000 times 430,900 equals what? 100,062,000 times 107,070,140 equals what? 14,181,777 times 158,683,445 equals what? 952,303,190 times 682,572,860 equals what? 1,004,080 times 7,554,000 equals what? 74,989,552 times 988,567,815 equals what? 26,874 times 757,280,094 equals what? 142,308 times 10,930,000 equals what? 650,800,065 times 910,651,963 equals what? 18,841,399 times 7,065,195 equals what? 555,067,923 times 140,667 equals what? 900,010,900 times 27,859,479 equals what? 20,388,026 times 5,596,563 equals what? 60,031 times 80,062,088 equals what? 934,798,211 times 894,327,146 equals what? 800,001 times 224,438,681 equals what? 700,030,194 times 818,090,400 equals what? 61,049,004 times 5 equals what? 75,710,191 times 900,080,102 equals what? 429,236 times 6,833,920 equals what? 940,002,809 times 390,043,009 equals what? 300 million times 343,685,389 equals what? 77,088,477 times 903,580,743 equals what? 782,744,436 times 960,026 equals what? 21 times 608,220 equals what? 578,046,822 times 406,760,556 equals what? 3,007 times 5,300,000 equals what? 572,859,624 times 211,296,167 equals what? 339,130,522 times 578,054,010 equals what? 503,329,088 times 486,985,795 equals what? 63,978,625 times 400,907,000 equals what? 881,828,223 times 57,001,000 equals what? 1,214,010 times 811,324,698 equals what? 760,001 times 1,595,549 equals what? 865,245,838 times 6,999,119 equals what? 840,008,904 times 646,977,090 equals what? 7,000 times 910,600,000 equals what? 3,173 times 3,045,663 equals what? 90,000 times 4,000 equals what? 179,004,008 times 278,794,410 equals what? 6,442,137 times 593,453,228 equals what? 265,756,752 times 5,060 equals what? 80,240,571 times 96,406,008 equals what? 51,422,357 times 138,948,452 equals what? 827,951,645 times 5,564,869 equals what? 3 million times 6,040,000 equals what? 6,743 times 675,394,318 equals what? 50,700,000 times 828 equals what? 3,842 times 300,000 equals what? 473,020,080 times 60,003,000 equals what? 981,310 times 9,221,309 equals what? 84,974,174 times 10,777 equals what? 772,534,421 times 1,369,095 equals what? 790,199,632 times 903,943,325 equals what? 261,188,532 times 7,227,864 equals what? 68,181,606 times 611,746,846 equals what? 391,579 times 317,010 equals what? 70,080,000 times 416,467 equals what? 56,139 times 100,709,309 equals what? 718,263,543 times 67,596,000 equals what? 9,077 times 700,004,670 equals what? 20,000 times 202,820 equals what? 238,654,127 times 111,003,300 equals what? 97,189,826 times 58,603,574 equals what? 105,929,024 times 2,394 equals what? 40,000 times 75,924,150 equals what? 71,239,941 times 40,603,604 equals what? 50 times 55,103 equals what? 100,728,264 times 368,422,876 equals what? 800,207 times 353,500,796 equals what? 2,197,861 times 483,505,304 equals what? 42,213,084 times 75,452,712 equals what? 70,003,008 times 100,580,400 equals what? 790,055,247 times 482,214,469 equals what? 14,208,671 times 487,339,189 equals what? 300,003,006 times 90,600 equals what? 40,480,003 times 100 million equals what? 80,006,004 times 70,401,000 equals what? 6,215,341 times 99 equals what? 42,732,469 times 375,110 equals what? 607,040,002 times 82,973,195 equals what? 8,300,008 times 604,987,305 equals what? 10,007,090 times 20,501,950 equals what? 556,767,789 times 681,394,910 equals what? 9 times 1,520,122 equals what? 20 million times 30,000 equals what? 900 million times 41,709 equals what? 121,667,368 times 87,462,144 equals what? 46,166,973 times 82,148,493 equals what? 871,838,646 times 86,806,730 equals what? 82,542,979 times 57,841,056 equals what? 158,248,420 times 57,948,642 equals what? 50,005 times 60,800 equals what? 119,980,023 times 380,432,301 equals what? 126,190,705 times 7 million equals what? 491,494,661 times 423,579,772 equals what? 954,657,885 times 48,106,622 equals what? 7,308,499 times 1,308,700 equals what? 430,466,827 times 9,758 equals what? 94,773 times 45,478,488 equals what? 376,790,100 times 376,070,204 equals what? 11,852,525 times 34,166,144 equals what? 801,053,902 times 430,301,388 equals what? 259,148,970 times 606,279,242 equals what? 492,996,989 times 144,255,695 equals what? 10,641,800 times 403,070,065 equals what? 522,357,973 times 204,503,018 equals what? 9,030 times 980,148,148 equals what? 200,002 times 966,500,000 equals what? 1,432,553 times 76,970,205 equals what? 536,974,908 times 925,420,000 equals what? 498,325 times 92,657 equals what? 607,320 times 50,005,721 equals what? 60,050 times 783,811,000 equals what? 40 times 300 equals what? 984,292,954 times 332,387,836 equals what? 41,406,370 times 805,000 equals what? 355,070,043 times 821,824,972 equals what? 77,787 times 11 equals what? 858,545,193 times 873,094,091 equals what? 3,173,267 times 83,595,356 equals what? 425,448,587 times 52,078 equals what? 606,699,203 times 20,020 equals what? 654,274,243 times 125,175,880 equals what? 46,304,240 times 3,476,845 equals what? 62,161,367 times 9,071 equals what? 660,851,460 times 80 equals what? 180,353,341 times 845,665,151 equals what? 90,400 times 994,209,000 equals what? 832,093 times 89,023 equals what? 631,083,970 times 43,227,868 equals what? 496,220,174 times 69,700 equals what? 492,994,631 times 1,562,122 equals what? 5,045,835 times 4,454,489 equals what? 906,093,097 times 992,077 equals what? 25,658,933 times 13,689 equals what? 206,091,400 times 883,620,282 equals what? 6,093 times 60,001 equals what? 68,126,466 times 34,381,987 equals what? 266,446,722 times 516,359,799 equals what? 92,564,664 times 472,786,010 equals what? 908,354,347 times 600,463,010 equals what? 898,656,004 times 985,468,251 equals what? 40,329,493 times 789,711,166 equals what? 432,332,215 times 136,468,786 equals what? 123,040 times 3,652,804 equals what? 8,832 times 2,931,373 equals what? 1,853,844 times 394 equals what? 13,851,144 times 35,009 equals what? 12,886,764 times 20,640,007 equals what? 360,102,090 times 920,213,477 equals what? 944,177,847 times 151,051,509 equals what? 231,642,588 times 55,090,010 equals what? 976,339,177 times 816,988,998 equals what? 7,593 times 3,034,710 equals what? 740,035 times 2010 equals what? 878,885,357 times 865,688,014 equals what? 390,600,670 times 400,400 equals what? 728,703,040 times 700,500 equals what? 2,005 times 800,010 equals what? 49,097,002 times 50,732,059 equals what? 325,314,102 times 200,806 equals what? 600 times 900 million equals what? 466,933,582 times 710,440,600 equals what? 506 million times 113,385,834 equals what? 21,092,035 times 52,195 equals what? 6,367 times 760,700 equals what? 51,040 times 74,717,685 equals what? 4,648,795 times 26,208,427 equals what? 87,246,336 times 58,616,465 equals what? 25,900 times 20,080,000 equals what? 792,675,278 times 2,977,442 equals what? 498,100,125 times 463,430,067 equals what? 5,309,896 times 966,271,951 equals what? 200,000 times 9,000 equals what? 395,364,578 times 3,963,318 equals what? 200 million times 54,638,741 equals what? 791,998,003 times 100,700,234 equals what? 81,521,661 times 29,771,733 equals what? 548,765,615 times 440,745,655 equals what? 54,956,833 times 809,170,056 equals what? 688,779,600 times 130,801,337 equals what? 43,123,154 times 802,060,000 equals what? 92,296,968 times 252,165,897 equals what? 6,410,808 times 704,403,240 equals what? 706 million times 73,000 equals what? 6,938,576 times 657,196,273 equals what? 2,868,639 times 7,243,397 equals what? 109,001,000 times 693,959,069 equals what? 250,300,076 times 132,132,341 equals what? 496,672,496 times 56,037,570 equals what? 1,400,050 times 850,179,781 equals what? 8,040,080 times 700,358,698 equals what? 1,000,000 times 628,065 equals what? 603,550 times 10,000 equals what? 3,595,649 times 84 equals what? 332 times 4,767,819 equals what? 620,652,728 times 20,300,000 equals what? 614,242,184 times 731,217,432 equals what? 70,007,000 times 317,699 equals what? 1,847 times 8,122,621 equals what? 6,542,274 times 37,208,770 equals what? 984,909,651 times 955,502,085 equals what? 230,070,526 times 646,225,997 equals what? 61,700 times 585,879,239 equals what? 802,007,284 times 76,713,111 equals what? 70,040,600 times 933,784,404 equals what? 808,000 times 6 million equals what? 32,433,983 times 313,955 equals what? 240,450,090 times 93,670,010 equals what? 132,490 times 194,670,033 equals what? 90,004 times 70,004,000 equals what? 600,303,029 times 18,643,798 equals what? 65,657,919 times 5,067,320 equals what? 13,004,070 times 41,562,327 equals what? 526,904 times 110,500,315 equals what? 794,703,296 times 88,266,336 equals what? 831,272 times 384,869,326 equals what? 6,100,700 times 180,648 equals what? 184,152,779 times 246,845,291 equals what? 808,083,000 2 times 303,200,500 equals what? 714,476,174 times 340,095,580 equals what? 300,005,000 times 42,635 equals what? 4,789,100 times 60,017 equals what? 160,350 times 400,091,000 equals what? 727,003,366 times 71,405,053 equals what? 7,855,022 times 690,220,050 equals what? 99,780,661 times 725,148,804 equals what? 21,177,216 times 327,559,755 equals what? 48,618,372 times 555,112,053 equals what? 390,040,000 times 996,910 equals what? 917,106,005 times 87,745,296 equals what? 3,015 times 784,185,359 equals what? 980,800,207 times 66 equals what? 865,129,139 times 9,093,604 equals what? 800 million times 200,000 equals what? 111,698,764 times 53,943 equals what? 404,506 times 392,977,151 equals what? 400,392,137 times 3,618 equals what? 609,918,923 times 426,199,117 equals what? 2,535,812 times 400,194,500 equals what? 49,560,910 times 179,020,930 equals what? 4,200,005 times 10,800 equals what? 660,409,822 times 791,833,391 equals what? 991,159,455 times 194,551,462 equals what? 935,429,509 times 35,890 equals what? 799,417,187 times 709,991,008 equals what? 187,297,920 times 556,714,912 equals what? 502,700,000 times 25,180,070 equals what? 10,305 times 657,625,357 equals what? 156,085,761 times 127,610 equals what? 50,015,020 times 30,007,703 equals what? 200,387,681 times 415,990,451 equals what? 70 million times 603,010,046 equals what? 712,130,127 times 70,580 equals what? 947,428,947 times 62,023 equals what? 200 times 100,849 equals what? 46,736,163 times 1,043,610 equals what? 917,346 times 2,005,669 equals what? 434,389 times 100 million equals what? 252,569,760 times 260,068,766 equals what? 200,041,000 times 2,423 equals what? 90,010 times 7,060,000 equals what? 404,694,910 times 902,056,300 equals what? 700 million times 910,601,706 equals what? 90 million times 162 equals what? 53,134,002 times 2,717 equals what? 508,956,999 times 875,006,010 equals what? 795,163,427 times 45,791,226 equals what? 5,011,684 times 600,089 equals what? 41,217 times 5,714,527 equals what? 29,313,823 times 754,631,288 equals what? 779,022,865 times 482,693,296 equals what? 7,000 times 81,388,973 equals what? 77,514 times 71,729,851 equals what? 4,300,039 times 30,200,009 equals what? 75,090,805 times 997,711,797 equals what? 39,838 times 531,672,845 equals what? 6,934 times 1,230,076 equals what? 4,131,785 times 8,860,654 equals what? 49,401,428 times 4,010 equals what? 649,189,096 times 218,327,748 equals what? 90,114,417 times 73,372,782 equals what? 609,300,069 times 100,407 equals what? 267,980,639 times 40,002,000 equals what? 568,297,356 times 966,439,887 equals what? 100,229,610 times 420,605,051 equals what? 661,663,804 times 558,276,617 equals what? 572,059,459 times 1,437,361 equals what? 278,427,442 times 870,047,790 equals what? 171,723,632 times 907,410,020 equals what? 891,550,644 times 80,500,080 equals what? 200,020,075 times 22,841,994 equals what? 335,191,260 times 729,967,959 equals what? 500,483,404 times 700,104,350 equals what? 8,400 times 680,380,840 equals what? 574,021,158 times 524,102,997 equals what? 3,206 times 3,060,402 equals what? 9,452,963 times 1,502,859 equals what? 797,846,471 times 428,518,119 equals what? 747,798 times 35,437,121 equals what? 100 million times 10,816 equals what? 3,000 times 257,058 equals what? 4,400,000 times 20,027,680 equals what? 801,432,300 times 730 equals what? 623,811,809 times 80,190,934 equals what? 11,918,790 times 5,166,283 equals what?